Thank you, James, for the wonderful introduction, and thank you to Danilo and Emma and the rest of the Abigail Adams team for giving me the opportunity to present here today. And I'd like to thank all of you for being here. I'm sure there are a lot more cozy things, if not maybe more interesting things, than listening to a talk on 19th century French political philosophy on such a rainy day. I'd like to thank my mom and Teddy for being here, and obviously the rest of my family who weren't able to be here for support with my education and all such things. And a couple other thank yous. First to Professor Ryan Hanley at Boston College. He was my advisor for this thesis. Thank you to Professor Brian Raymond. He was the director of the Perspectives program for a long time, and this was a thesis through the Perspectives program, which is a great books subfield in the philosophy department at Boston College. And a big thank you also to Father Jeff Lankin for introducing me to Lamennais, the subject of my thesis. And that's a good little segue into an introduction of, well, I'm sure many of you are asking, who is Félicité de Lamone? If you've heard of him, you've probably only heard of him in passing and don't know particularly much about him. As a little brief biography, he was a French Catholic priest, born in 1782 and died in 1854. So he lived and worked in the first half of the 19th century. He started his career as an ultramontane monarchist. So as an ultramontanist, he was an advocate of the power of the papacy as opposed to, say, local and national councils of bishops. And in France, that was particularly opposed to Gallicanism. He started his public career writing about the question of certainty. Most specifically, how we can know with certainty that the Catholic Church is the one true church and faith. His first major text, his first book that he wrote on his own, was called An Essay on Indifference in Matters of Religion, which was published in 4 volumes from 1817 to 1823, and it caught fire across Europe, even earning him a private papal audience with Pope Leo XII. He was quite popular and considered maybe the foremost Catholic apologist in Europe at the time. However, his biography is quite fascinating. He ended up being condemned by 2 papal encyclicals of Pope Gregory XVI in 1832 and 1834, respectively. He continued to write prolifically throughout his career after his excommunication and undertook various political activities. And he died outside of the church as an excommunicate liberal Democrat. So a man who started his career as an advocate of the power of the papacy and as a monarchist died as an opponent of monarchy outside of the walls of the Catholic Church, so to speak. So apart from asking, who is he? I'm sure a lot of you would ask, why on earth should I care? If I've never heard of him, why is he important at all? And so to start with a couple, introductory questions. So if you take away anything from this, I hope it's exploring these questions for yourself and maybe seeing Lamennais as a particular avenue to explore them, a particular historical example and influence. So his main project, the main project for which he was ultimately condemned, with respect to political philosophy, was understanding the separation of church and state. So in general, I think as good modern Americans, we all believe in some kind of separation of church and state in general, but it's important for us to understand what we mean when we say that. What do we mean by separation? What do we mean by church? What do we mean by state? And it seems that there are 2 main kinds of separation. There's an institutional separation and a thematic separation. Institutionally, the church and the state are 2 different organizations that our religious leaders are not our political leaders and vice versa. I've heard it said, although I've never read it, that Napoleon found Islam particularly fascinating because it didn't have this sort of institutional separation. That the caliphate was both the religious leader and the political leader in a sense. And of course, Napoleon was an arch nemesis of Lamennais, so it's just worth mentioning. But the focus here is more on the thematic separation. So helping us understand the difference between religious and political questions. And defining what is a religious question and how does it differ from a political question. And so there are a lot of different sub-questions that we continue to ask ourselves today in America, in the West, in a modern liberal state. Things like, what political role can and should religious institutions play, if any, in politics? Can a political society, and specifically its government, establish and enforce a public orthodoxy regarding any kind of religious or even philosophical question? Can the state define human happiness and legislate accordingly? And if so, to what extent? What limitations can government put on a private person's freedom to define their happiness and to strive to attain it? what is the relationship, if any, between morality and law? These are all these sorts of questions that Lamennais is helpful to consider in light of. And again, he's particularly important because he addresses a lot of modern forms of these questions. In a way, these questions are timeless in that, human nature hasn't particularly changed much over the last 1,000 years, if at all, and that these political questions are just part of human life. And he addresses them in the context of the rise of skepticism that came out of particularly Cartesian philosophy, the Reformation, which challenged the authority of the institutional Catholic Church, and the French Revolution most especially, which challenged the inherent authority of the government, independent of people or individuals. So, insofar as these are modern forms of questions that we address here, he's particularly important because he shared these same modern concerns. And he helps us to weigh the merits of liberal Catholicism in particular. Again, if folks here are Catholic or Christian, many of us would also consider ourselves liberal in the broader philosophical sense that, the emphasis on individual human rights, the origins of government coming, say, from some kind of social contract theory, the consent of the governed. And even if we don't hold that sort of liberalism, we held it at one time because this is the milieu that we live in. I don't think that's a particularly controversial claim. And Lamennais tries to balance both of these sorts of claims and helps us to understand the ways in which they might not, mesh as cleanly as we think they do between modern political liberalism and some of the claims of Catholicism with respect to politics. To quote him, he says, "Like all Frenchmen, we submit to the political and civil laws of the country as long as they do not infringe upon the sacred rights of conscience. We do not recognize the state's authority in all that concerns religion, our worship, our discipline, and our teaching. In this purely spiritual order, we are free in virtue of this law. We owe obedience only to the spiritual leader given to us by Jesus Christ," by whom he meant the Pope. So Lamennais tries to combine these two authorities, the authority of this modern liberal state and the authority of the Church and her ministers. He tries to preserve the freedom of the Church from the state, the freedom of Catholics to deliberate and act politically, and also the freedom of other religious institutions and their members, a concern for religious pluralism, which remains a foremost concern for us in modern America. And it's worth noting that I would argue that his thoughts should be interpreted primarily as a matter of political philosophy. Lamennais was certainly a political actor. He had practical political concerns, and much of the scholarship around his thought consists in a political and historical interpretation of his work, similarly with its condemnation. But it's worth noting that Lamennais touches on matters of first principle, the meaning of authority, the meaning of freedom, their relationship, the meaning of church and state, and what it means for them to be separated, if at all, what we mean by religious freedom. These are matters of first principles and first philosophy. And it's also worth noting that Lamennais is a man of vast transformations. You need to be careful defining which period of thought that you're addressing here. And I'm looking at his writings particularly from 1829 to 1835, this period in which he was a liberal Catholic. Liberal insofar as he had rejected the monarchy, Catholic insofar as he had not yet been excommunicated or rejected some of the essential claims of authority of the institutional Roman Catholic Church. And I'm drawing particularly from articles of a magazine that he had helped found and was the spearhead on, called L'Avenir, meaning the future. And from a preface of collected essays and articles from that magazine. He wrote prolifically, and not much of it is translated into English. And my French is not good enough to have read in the original, so there's a kind of limitation on the works that I've been able to read, but these are of the foremost importance regardless. So first, it's important to define what he means by authority and freedom and their relationship. He writes, quote, "The question now, given the Catholic system, is to know how these two orders of obedience and freedom, equally legitimate, equally necessary, can subsist together, both complete and both independent." So again, he's trying to maintain the fullness of both freedom and authority as he understands them. He defines authority as, quote, "the right to command," end quote. And of course, obedience is a necessary corollary. If someone can command something, obedience is due to that command. Now, his definition of freedom is a little bit more ambiguous. It's difficult to define. Dr. John Rao has spoken about that this was potentially played a role in his condemnation, that freedom was used in a way that was at least contrary to the practical interests of the church, you could say, in the 19th century, through the cry of liberty, fraternity and equality of the French Revolution and many other revolutionary groups. So his definition of freedom is very difficult to pin down. But it seems that he means it at least as a negation of authority, that where authority exists, freedom cannot, and vice versa. He says, quote, freedom will absorb authority or authority freedom, that these both exist in different domains and in different areas, but they cannot exist in the same respect at the same time, that there's a sort of principle of non-contradiction here. And he's interested mainly in authority over thought. Again, that was kind of the initiation of his public career, what it means to have certainty and to find certainty. And so he thinks that authority is particularly important for thought, for the ability to know, think, and act according to what we think. He says, quote, the least religious philosophy, therefore, necessarily has its dogmas and objects of faith just as religion does. So authority is necessary for thought in any sort of systematized form. And it's necessary for common action. He says, quote, without common beliefs from which common duties are derived, there is no stable society or even any possible society, end quote. So for people to be united in any kind of society, whether political or otherwise, there needs to be an authority over what dogmas are guiding their practical actions. And this is included in his particularly expansive definition of religion also. He says, quote, this bond of minds, this law that in regulating thoughts and wills brings individuals to the social unit is what people call religion. So in that definition, then we can see a kind of expansion to a political society that shares common dogmas, a kind of public orthodoxy. And that'll be important for helping us understand the way he distinguishes between religious and political questions, that definition of religion is particularly expansive. And so through these definitions he provides of authority and freedom and authority over thought, it seems that all thought and all societies require some sort of authority, some manner of authority. So again, we need to keep in mind what a religious question is and the relationship of church and state in light of these definitions of religion, authority, and freedom. Further, we should look at what he means by truth, reason, and certainty, and how respective authorities may attain authority over truth, authority to define dogma, and such, how we attain certainty. He says, quote, in itself, the question of certainty includes two elements, the truth independent of reason, and reason which perceives the truth. The infallible assurance of actually perceiving it, of knowing it, and of possessing it, constitutes certainty according to its most extended notion. Now, reason being essentially only the faculty of perceiving truth and knowing it, it follows that certainty is only essentially reason itself, and that thus this question, what is certainty, reduces itself to this one, what is reason? So that where reason is the most perfect, it is also necessary there that certainty is the greatest. So to break that down a little bit, he believes that truth exists independent of reason, that truth is not merely, say, a matter of social contract and of human convention, and that it is reason's job and it's reason's ability to recognize and assent to that truth that's independent of human convention. He believes truth is infinite and unitary, that it is, he would say, one or nothing at all. And on the side of reason, he distinguishes between two kind of subfields of reason, faith and science. He says, quote, the mode according to which the mind knows or embraces the infinite is called faith. The mode according to which it knows or possesses the finite is called knowledge or science. So, again, to kind of situate him in his context, he rejects a radical skepticism. He believes that certainty is possible, and that there are different kind of modes of certainty. There's certainty with respect to the infinite, to finite matters of revelation and such, and of science, and that's where freedom resides, the finite with respect to human convention and such. And he implies two different means by which we communicate that certainty to others once we know it, either as individuals or as institutions. Material force or persuasion. And he says, quote, the truth is all powerful. What most retards its triumph is the support that material force tries to lend it. It is the very appearance of constraint in the essentially free domain of conscience and reason. It is brutal violence that violates and profanes the sanctuary of the soul where God alone has the right to penetrate, end quote. So he believes that certainty is possible and it is attained only through persuasion, that any attempt of material force, be it through the state or otherwise, is incapable of helping us attain certainty. That if you believe something, say, at the points of gun, whether directly or indirectly through kind of the force of law, that is not truly certainty, that's not truly knowledge. He then distinguishes different means of attaining certainty, and the distinction we'll start with here is between common sense and individual reason. By common sense, he means what all people at all times and all places have known and believed, in an elevated and perfected kind of individual reason. That's a very complicated concept. It's not purely his own, and it's difficult to speak in superlatives that way. But that's the sense in which he means it. A quote to contrast it with the individual reason. He says, "The common sense being obviously superior to the individual reason, since it includes all that there is in common particular reasons, which is, in our regard, the faculty of knowing raised to its highest power, it therefore constitutes true human reason, and consequently certainty for men in general, insofar as it is this very reason, perceiving the truth according to its nature, and for each man individually, this same reason manifesting itself by some means external to invariable perceptions," by which he means the common sense perfects the individual reason, that we can know things individually and we can know them certainly, but that error is individual and truth is common and shared. It's shared by all people at all times and in all places. And that is the individual reason that errs, rather than the common reason of all people. And this will be particularly important as we move forward. So from there we move to the way that he tries to separate the church and the state, his basis of separation. So he distinguishes between the spiritual and temporal domain. The spiritual domain pertains to faith, to the divine law, to that form of certainty. And their authority is necessary because it is a certainty held by all people at all times, and we are capable of calling others to agreement of it. However, human opinion and human will corresponds to science, to this knowledge of the finite, and to temporal society. And that is the basis upon which he will separate church and state. He says, in an extended quote, "For just as there exists for reason two orders, one of faith, the other of science, so there are two equally distinct orders in relation to human actions, one that contains all that which is prescribed by divine law, the other in which men behave according to their opinions, in which is then dependent on their will for the motives, and within the same limits as the order of science depends on their reason. This second order forms the proper domain of temporal society, which can only subsist as a society by means of an authority of the same kind, that is to say, an authority determined in various respects by human conventions, as we shall soon explain, while spiritual society and the authority that governs it are by their nature independent of any kind of convention." End quote. So temporal society, the state, these are guided by human convention, by this sort of freedom, that there's a limited, if any, way in which authority can define things with certainty and require the sense of all people, as opposed to the spiritual authority, say, of the church, that can say this has been true for all times and all manners in which all people ought to believe. That is much more universal and it much more accords with truth as it purely exists in a unitary and infinite form. And that and at the same time, both of these are important realms that, while it is much more limited, the temporal society and the freedom that corresponds to it is important and ought to be preserved. And at the same time, the authority of a spiritual institution like the church also ought to be preserved in their fullness. He wants to preserve them equally, and he wants to prevent their mutual encroachment. Again, the encroachment of the state on the church, but also the church on the state, to allow for kind of religious pluralism for those who do not voluntarily accept the claims and the authority of the church, but also of the freedom of the church over the members of the church from her authority. That Catholics have the freedoms to deliberate and act politically independent of, say, practical political measures given by bishops and priests and such. That he's trying to preserve all these different kinds of freedoms in their own realms and drawing distinct and total walls of separation between them. So, again, returning to some of the big questions he's asking how can the authorities of church and state be recognized separately in a way that does not lead to a contradiction in principle, and that given contradiction occurs in practice, even if we avoid it in principle, even if we avoid it in theory, he wants to know how that the contradictory claims can be adjudicated, how we can point to, say, this area and say the church has authority over that, and point to another area and say the state has authority over that, and then point to a different area and say only the individual, apart from church and state, has the authority over that to make claims as to what is true and how you ought to act accordingly. So then, given this distinction between the spiritual and temporal societies, we move to what he means by the state. The state is determined by human conventions. Again, it is the authority over temporal society. And it explicitly operates according to material force. He implies this extensively, and it seems that there's no other way to kind of draw that separation. We can recall Max Weber's definition of the modern state as a community that successfully claims monopoly over violence within a geographical area, which is required to have legitimate and legal authority. That it's impossible to separate the sort of material force from the authority of the state. And that is how he understands it. And given that, he says pretty starkly that no one must be obliged to give an account of his faith to human authority, end quote. And that further, quote, whether you admit the existence of God or deny it, you are equally forced to recognize that political authority in itself does not possess any legitimate authority over thought or conscience, that it is not without extravagance, and sometimes not without crime, that it established itself as judge of true and false, of good and evil, of the just and unjust, that henceforth beliefs, worships, even opinions, and in general everything that constitutes the spiritual order is by right independent of it. So, given his definitions of reason, of the means by which we persuade people, and the nature of the state's authority, this is, I guess you could say, liberal neutrality par excellence. That the state can make no claims of public orthodoxy, whether over religion, over philosophy, over claims of the good, justice, morality, etc. That is completely without the bounds of the state. Not that those things don't exist, but that they're completely separate and distinct from our politics. The state does not have the means to judge, whether in the activity of individual legislators, of particular judges, etc. And even if it did have the means to judge and make claims of truth, it does not have the means to enforce or teach these things, given the authority of the state is forceful. At one point, he held that you could not strictly separate this kind of concern for truth, morality, justice, etc., from the political realm. But as he moves throughout his liberal period, he sheds that thought, as it is within a contradiction between this total separation that he attempts to draw. So we move from there to the condemnation. Gregory XVI's encyclical Morare Vos, which had implicitly condemned Lamennais, its writings, and Lamennais in particular. It didn't name him, but everyone knew that it was directed at him and at his project, him being Lamennais. And again, this encyclical is also a matter of political philosophy, that it pertains to first principles. And this is not a commonly held position in scholarship. One scholar writes that the encyclical was first and foremost a document of circumstance. It sought above all to silence dissensions that Lamennais raised. Another scholar writes, it is in fact clear enough, even when the evidence arrayed against Lamennais by Rome itself is considered, that the main grounds of his condemnation were not religious, but political in character. And it's important to note that politics and history did have an important role in this, certainly. Gregory XVI didn't want to make any statements regarding Lamennais or Lamennais or his thought. But those were certainly influential in the writing of the encyclical. But the argument of the encyclical pertains to political philosophy, first principles, not merely a matter of different warring ecclesiastical groups in France, because Lamennais was not particularly popular with the bishops, to put it lightly. So if you look at the content of the encyclical, what it actually condemns, it starts with condemnations of some of the various freedoms that Lamennais and Lamennais had advocated for, freedoms that we're all pretty familiar with advocating for ourselves. Freedom of education, of association, of the press. However, it's not particularly a condemnation of those freedoms in principle, because Lamennais himself, that those freedoms are derivative of his argument about this separation of church and state and religious freedom, that these are merely the practical effects of the broader principled argument that he's making. And Gregory XVI didn't say this, but I think he would, many others would say that you can advocate for some of these other freedoms apart from the first principles Lamennais was arguing for them. So the encyclical is primarily a condemnation of Lamennais' theory of the separation of church and state and religious freedom. Gregory XVI condemns, quote, religious indifference, which he defines as a perverse opinion according to which a man can gain eternal salvation by any profession of any faith, provided that his morals are correct and honest, end quote. Similarly, he being Gregory XVI, condemns this theory of the separation of church and state, saying, quote, the separation of church and state and the breaking of mutual harmony of secular and priestly rule, that he condemns that breaking. Now on its face, this condemnation seems a little bit interesting and almost even absurd when we, again, remember the career of Lamennais. That Lamennais was a man who attained a papal audience for his advocacy of Catholicism, for his text explicitly rejecting religious indifference. Again, the title of his first major work was An Essay on Matter of Religious Indifference, which he strongly condemns. So it seems odd, and again, worthy of our probing, that Gregory XVI would condemn religious indifference with respect to Lamennais. That seems bizarre. And similarly, the church herself advocates for a kind of separation between church and state. So again, we need to be clear what we mean when we say that. Given the church distinguishes between bishops and princes, Lamennais himself, with even the support of various bishops and such, wanted this institutional separation. At the time, priests were under the rule of the constitutional monarchy established at the July Revolution of 1830. And prior to that, I believe, too, priests were paid employees of the state. That Catholic priests received their money upon which to live, their paychecks from the state. Lamennais had a huge problem with this. Many in the church did also. So then, if that kind of separation isn't what Gregory XVI is condemning, what is he condemning? And from there we move to what Lamennais means by the church. So earlier we looked at the way that Lamennais compares the common sense and the individual reason as means to certainty, but he also considers whether or not the institutional church has any ability to attain certainty on questions. And he rejects that. He rejects that claim in three different ways. He says first that, and this is not a quote, this is a paraphrase, that if one recognizes the authority of the church, they do so by means of their reason, meaning that their reason is the basis for certainty rather than the claims of the church. That your reason by which you judge the church's claim makes it superior to the claims of the church. Secondly, that the church's authority is not subject to that kind of rational inquiry, that there's no means of distinguishing between religious fanaticism, as he calls it, and true certainty, that there's no means then to distinguish between the claims of, say, the Catholic Church and any other religious group. And that thirdly, that the church's claims to certainty herself are limited. They're limited over the prescriptions of divine law and the received moral law, as Lamennais puts it. And he says, quote, that their claims to certainty reside exclusively on the revelation consigned to the scriptures, preserved by the divinely inspired church, which perpetually promulgates and interprets it. So again, returning to his understanding of reason, although he distinguishes two subfields of reason, faith and science, the way that he looks at the way that he looks at truth is unitary. He would say that if there's one means of attaining certainty, if there's one truth, there should be one means of attaining certainty. And the church cannot claim a limited kind of certainty over a particular area, be it revelation or morals or otherwise. That there needs to be one kind of certainty, one overarching form of reason, which there might be subfields of, but if you try to limit the means by which you define your certainty, that you may either deny certainty in other areas or deny your own means to attaining that. He says, quote, finally, the results from the system are that in everything that is not the object of teaching of the church, there exists no certainty for man, end quote. So through this, he ultimately rejects any institutional claim to authority, even over revelation, morality, etc., that the church claims. And if certainty then comes from the common sense, Catholicism is only true insofar as it happens to align with the common sense at the time. That he's not looking to the institutional church for authority and guidance in any matters, but rather for the common sense. And if they happen to align, then cool, then the church happens to align with that at the time. And if it doesn't, well, then the church is wrong and the common sense is right. He's very limited view of the church in that respect. And he says that even if we were to draw these distinctions in principle, that the distinction wouldn't work in practice, and practice is important to politics, because there's no precedent for that people have always been divided on the application of distinguishing between church and state, between their different realms of authority. And he says, quote, if we conceive of a society where authority, deprived of all spiritual attribution, was only that of a simple administrator of material interests of the state, and that only by delegation, all the rest remaining free, the difficulty would be less great, but only in appearance, as we shall soon see. So in this sense, he actually even draws some criticism on itself, that even if we try to theoretically distinguish between church and state in this way, as he has done, that won't provide us any guidance in practice, that it won't be possible to build a politics from that. And from there, then, we see his further movement through the rest of his career to democratic liberalism, to a kind of deism of sorts, and he never rejected he never rejected any of these claims in their fullness, even following the condemnation. And so, in conclusion, we can say that Gregory's condemnation of religious indifference follows logically from Lamennais' theories of authority and freedom, reason and certainty in church and state. That Lamennais' theory of certainty, residing ultimately and only in the common sense, demands the rejection of any inherent authority in either the church or the state to make claims of true and false, or good and bad, with certainty. This denial of the church's inherent authority rejects the infallible teaching authority of the church in principle, or the role of law as teacher. It denies the ability of the church to issue practical guidances on issues of economics, politics, and other human endeavors related to the state, law, and the political process. In his theory, the church can neither enlighten the mind, as it lacks certainty, nor direct by her precepts the life and conduct of each and all, as this denies freedom in the temporal realm. Neither can the intervention of the law and of state authority stem from moral force, as this denies the independence of the spiritual domain. The state, then, has no spiritual authority for Lamennais, and the church has no temporal authority, and ultimately, the church even lacks spiritual authority given its original rather than derivative certainty within this model. So we return to some of the earlier questions that I posed. How then are church and state thematically separate for Lamennais, given his definition of religion and the argument of the necessity of common beliefs and duties for society and for practical action? Following the entirety of his argument, people, as individuals or in aggregate, can be indifferent to religion insofar as they can claim an authority distinct from and superior to the institutional Catholic Church. That is the sense in which there's an indifference that Gregory condemns. That authority resides in the aggregate of the people in the common sense, and that any alignment between the common sense and the institutional Catholic Church is accidental rather than essential. Additionally, within this model, the church and state can be indifferent to each other, as neither has the authority to command assent to assertions of true and false, good and bad, or even mere opinions. Thus, the papal condemnation of the former ultramontane who once earned a pope's praise for his defense of Catholicism on the basis of this very theory of certainty loses its ironic bite, though it does not address the standing potential contradiction, that of arguing that church and state can be separated and religious freedom protected even while society, and thus political society, is necessarily and inherently religious. In this sense, one scholar, Lasky, says that Lamennais can still, as he remains to the end, be considered in the full sense of the word, a theocrat. Lamennais and his thought bear special importance for contemporary Catholics seeking to reconcile Catholicism with fundamental liberal assumptions of the modern state. He failed to provide such practical guidance, given that he and the Church alike declared his project of liberal Catholicism as a synthesis to be a failure, because he abandoned his Catholic premises and retained only his liberalism. Even if Lamennais' name fails to falls unrecognized on the ears of American Catholics, his thought bears particularly importance and a strong influence. He's helpful as a guide for us considering how we can further hone our understanding of these questions. He is clearly not the only liberal Catholic, but he is important to understand the ways in which we use the terms that we commonly take as our assumptions. And that, as a closing note, in the words of Lasky, he dare not be forgotten so long as men are willing to examine the principles upon which their life is founded. For few have faced so courageously the difficulties of existence. None has suffered more nobly in the effort to confound them. Thank you.